Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Apologies, Mrs. Masekela seems to have encountered a technical glitch. But I thank her very much for being here, to my fellow speakers at the event tonight, the members of the University Panel on Responsible Investment, as well as all of those of you in attendance, including our Vice-Chancellor. This is really something of a landmark occasion, the public launch of a university panel dedicated to advancing responsible investment of the University of Cape Town Endowment. As far as we're aware, we are the first institution in the Global South to take this step. We're also acutely mindful that there are many hard miles still to be trod, but even getting to this very first step carries with it a longer journey that has been largely invisible to the university community to date. UPRI was established by the University Council 4 years ago in 2017, in no small measure in response to external pressure brought about at meetings of the university convocation and elsewhere. But at its inception, its terms of reference were nebulous, and there's no clear policy defining its mandate or the university's approach to responsible investment. There was uncertainty about lines of accountability and the scope of its authority and responsibility. Consequently, UPRI was largely moribund for most of the first couple of years of its existence. And that was something which was aggravated as the university's attention was directed elsewhere by the forces affecting the university system in South Africa from 2015 onwards. I was appointed by the Vice-Chancellor as chair of UPRI in January 2019, 2 years ago. On assuming the chair, a process of redrafting UPRI's mandate in terms of reference was begun, tying this to a university responsible investment policy, which was approved by the University Council after engagement with the Joint Investment Committee and its trustees in December 2020. Environmental, social, and governance factors, ESG factors, have to be taken into account when selecting fund managers, by those fund managers when building their portfolios, and monitored on an ongoing basis. As part of the clarification of UPRI's mandate, the chair of UPRI now sits ex officio on the Joint Investment Committee, and UPRI's role there will be to ensure that responsible investment is not a mere box-ticking exercise. The responsible investment policy, which is available on the UPRI website, sets out the university's approach to responsible investment, which is closely aligned with that of the United Nations principle on responsible investment. Sorry, I just want to put this up. There you go. Sorry. That said, the University Panel on Responsible Investment has adopted an expansive view of responsible investment, expanding not only the impacts on the economic value of the investments, but also the impact that ESG factors have on environment and on society. Overarching this is a commitment to the global development agenda set out through the United Nations' Sustainable Development Goals, and the university's articulation of a vision of contributing to the creation of a fair and just society, in which the university seeks to redefine and co-create a global sustainable future. There are still matters being ironed out. Understanding the implications of the responsible investment policy for the Joint Investment Committee and their fund managers, also matters related to UPRI's role in shaping responsible investment at UCT at an implementation level. Questions such as shareholder activism, disclosure of the endowment's holdings, and proxy voting on the university's holdings. For UPRI to succeed and to make a meaningful change to the direction in which the university endowment is managed, we need to be a sounding board for the university community, very broadly defined, not only staff and students, but also the community and the society in which we live. The UPRI has to serve as the point of pressure, as well as the clearinghouse for the wishes, views, aspirations of our university community. In turn, several things are going to become important, first of which relates to disclosure, the ability to offer meaningful information to our broad university community on our holdings, on our ESG risks and processes, on shareholder engagement, both by fund managers, and where and if directly undertaken by the university. A second aspect relates to the independence of UPRI. UPRI is a creation of the University Council, and it is advisory to the Council and the trustees. Yet UPRI must also, and has fought for the right, to make its recommendations to the Joint Investment Committee, the trustees, and the Council, to make those recommendations public, a crucial mechanism of building trust and accountability within our broader community. A third aspect which we still need to engage with is one of building engagement with other higher education institutions in the Global South, university endowments in South Africa. And this is an area of work, particularly given the nature of the university and their tendencies towards trying to lead society in appropriate directions. While today sees us launch the public-facing work of UPRI, it is also Global Earth Day. And that's very apposite. Anthropogenic climate change is a reality. Professor Biden announced this morning that the US is going to seek to reduce their carbon emissions by 50% in the next few years. But not least due to its global import, but also because it has been that focal point of pressure brought to bear on the university, UPRI has elected to make the debate around fossil fuels and responsible investment its first substantive engagement with our university community. And this will only be the first. As UPRI, we are proactively identifying other areas of concern, but we also require and need the input from the university community in this regard. Fossil fuels currently account for approximately 2.5% of the foundation's total assets, including our domestic holdings, and around 5% of our domestic portfolio. In contradistinction, investments in renewable energy accounts for around about 1.8% of our total portfolio. How the university endowment should respond to this issue is a matter of some subtlety and nuance, bearing in mind the need for a just energy transition in the process of global development. To this end, we have commenced a process of consultation and engagement, seeking out the views of the university community on this crucial issue. The consultation process was launched by means of an email sent to our university community some 10 days ago, and our intention is to make a recommendation after following due process to the University Council at its September 2021 meeting. I urge the entire community to engage with us. Further details are on the UPRI website, and submissions and comments can be sent to the email address that is shown on the screen now. Again, I thank you all for being present. I look forward to the discussion and debate that will no doubt continue long after this meeting has happened. Thank you very much, and I yield back to Ms. Masekela.
Our next speaker, thank you, Professor Moultrie. Our next speaker is Xolisa Dlamini. Xolisa is a lecturer in sustainable and responsible investing with over 13 years of professional experience in institutional investment advisory. He is the lead researcher for African Investing for Impact Barometer, a report which analyzes the spectrum of investing for impact strategies, IFI, implemented by mainstream and private equity. He is the former head of the African network of the UN-supported Principles for Responsible Investment, PRI. Prior to PRI, he held investment consulting roles at leading consulting firms in South Africa. Xolisa, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Masekela. Thank you very much to the panel for inviting me to speak as one of the panelists. I really am very happy to be part of this occasion. And thank you to all the attendees for giving us a moment of their time to celebrate this milestone. It's a very big milestone in terms of the university. And it's a big milestone for something that I hold very dear to my heart in terms of, you know, the way we make use of our financial capital. And when Prof. Tom reached out to me, he was essentially asking me to, you know, highlight the imperative of responsible investments, especially for universities, you know, in the developing economies. And I thought a useful way to approach it is to look at it from a sustainability perspective, i.e. why responsible investment practices are important for sustainability and survival of universities, including those in developing economies. Responsible investment proposes that owners and managers of financial capital systematically and explicitly incorporate these environmental, social, or governance factors into the management processes. The aim is to better manage obstacles to the sustainability of their respective economies and the sustainability of the institutions themselves in operating in those economies. The obstacles to sustainability include environmental obstacles and social obstacles. Climate change, for instance, is an environmental obstacle which also exacerbates social obstacles such as inequality and poverty, which collectively threaten the sustainability of socioeconomic development. And in this instance, universities play a multifaceted role in their respective economies and have multiple demands placed upon them. For instance, universities are expected to prepare human capital to lead and participate meaningfully in socioeconomic development. This requires students.
It's muted.
This requires students to gain access to universities and other areas of higher learning. This in turn requires the students to be able to afford the university fees to study in the first place. Additionally, the participation of graduates in the market requires thriving and sustainable economies to absorb these graduates as soon as they finish their qualification. So to an extent, this is something that is an important value proposition of the degrees that all our universities offer. To what extent will I, as a graduate, make it in an economy that is perhaps not so sustainable? Secondly, universities are expected to produce knowledge and research in order for societies to navigate these environmental and social challenges, as well as opportunities. This requires the funding through contracts with other economic actors. This funding source can be constrained by poor or unsustainable economic growth, thus impacting the potential research funding available. Thirdly, universities are also allocators of financial capital to the financial system through their investments. And they typically would invest assets, in endowments, foundations, and even in the retirement funds. They invest in order to generate financial returns and supplement revenues, which will help to keep the universities going as going concerns. The generation of financial return requires economies to grow. Most importantly, this economic growth needs to be sustainable for generations to come. This means that environmental and social risks to sustainable growth have an impact on the university income. In a nutshell, universities need to be more deliberate in managing the risks that affect their sustainability. It's increasingly evident that environmental and social challenges such as climate risks, inequality, poverty, and barriers to inclusive economies do pose risks to the sustainability of universities. And you can see that non-financial issues such as environmental and social issues impact the finances used to keep the university's doors open. For universities in the developing markets, however, the severity and the detrimental effect of environmental and social challenges are arguably more profound relative to those in developed markets. With our higher levels of poverty and inequality, students in developing countries are less likely to be able to afford fees to gain access to higher education. We've seen this with the Fees Must Fall movement in 2015 and that resurging now in 2021. It's a very clear signal our children cannot afford university education. The negative effects of climate change are also relatively more pronounced in developing countries and exacerbate poverty and inequality in developing countries. This is similar when you see the current pandemic and its effect on our developing economies. It's another threat to social sustainability, which has had financial impact on universities needing to roll out emergency remote learning programs, just for instance. These environmental and social issues also impact negatively on the sustainability of economic growth in developing economies. And hence, they impact the ability of universities as investors to generate sustainable investment returns, and it makes it very difficult for the markets that they operate in to absorb the human capital that they've trained. So it has become very difficult to argue that these environmental and social challenges are irrelevant to us all. It's also become very difficult to ignore that these environmental and social risks and opportunities are also becoming financially material for our institutions. And in this regard, they do require our systematic action in various roles universities play in society. RI is just one of the approaches available to universities to manage the threats to their survival and ultimately their sustainability. So explicitly incorporating environmental and social considerations in all decisions and action presents our universities with the opportunity to influence better financial systems for their survival, and also solidifies the relevance of universities, especially in the Global South, their relevance to us in society. So that for me is how I would like to encapsulate the reason why it's quite important to have responsible investment policies that are implemented, and it's very encouraging to be attending an event where this is happening at our own university. Thank you. I give back to you, Ms. Masekela.
I'd like to go on to the next speaker, who is Antonia Code, who is the head of sustainability and corporate affairs at Oxford University Endowment Management, the investment manager for the University of Oxford and its colleges. The team manages over 5 billion in a globally diversified multi-asset portfolio. For over 7 years, Antonia has led sustainability and ESG policy development and implementation at the OUEM. Over this time, she has been involved in 2 reviews of Oxford University's approach to climate change and fossil fuels across its investments. And she sits on its Environmental Sustainability Committee. Antonia is a graduate of the University of Oxford, where she studied geography. Antonia?
Barbara, thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you, UPRI, for having me on this panel. It's exciting to be here at your launch. I'd also like to thank Lisa. Hopefully I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that you've just covered in your comments, because I'm here to give a perspective from Oxford University, and particularly from its endowment team. And over the next 10 minutes or so, I'll outline how we, over the past decade, have integrated sustainability and ESG into our investment process. I'll also give an overview of the 2 divestment processes that have taken place at Oxford University during that time. And I'll conclude with a brief moment on lessons learned and what's next from us. So just a very quick introduction to Oxford University Endowment Management to pick up on comments from Barbara. We manage the university's long-term investments as well as endowments from many of the colleges and trusts, so over 5 billion in total. And our purpose is to make an investment return over the long time horizons of our investors, to provide significant funding to fund their purposes, and in particular education and research. We only manage charitable assets, so investing sustainably is deeply ingrained in our investment philosophy and company culture. Each of the colleges is a separate investor, so we are a regulated investment manager and subject to substantial regulatory scrutiny as well as internal governance. I'm now going to talk a little bit about our investment approach. So as an investor, we cannot fulfill our purpose without considering all long-term risks, and these include environmental and social risks, of which, of course, climate change is one of these. We think the analysis of these risks should be integrated throughout the investment process and not seen as somehow separate. We view sustainability through 2 lenses, risk management, but also investment opportunities. So taking the first of those, risk management, whilst we're not investing in individual companies, what we're actually doing is looking to source and evaluate the very best investment groups globally. Key for us is finding groups who behave like business owners. These groups tend to have small portfolios and can have meaningful engagement with the companies they invest in on a range of issues, including environmental and social concerns. We have a very engaged investment process with these groups, and through our regular dialogue, we can tackle long-term investment risks such as climate change. So, for example, our companies planning for a net zero world, as well as more immediate environmental and social risks across the portfolio. But the second piece for us within sustainability is really about using the exceptionally long-term capital we manage to invest in opportunities presented by sustainability. So the start point of our investment process is to think of an investment theme. And for over a decade, one of these themes has been resource efficiency. And that's really trying to answer the questions how the world will adapt to the inevitable change on the dependency of fossil fuels. So using this theme, we've seen investments across our portfolio, including venture portfolio backing innovative solutions that answer this question. So companies that might reduce our demand for resources. We've also backed group designing sustainable investment products, and we're looking at natural capital in our property portfolio. Again, through this theme of resource efficiency, we only have limited investments in the energy sector, and the portfolio has been effectively divested from fossil fuels for several years. We only have a minimal residual indirect exposure to fossil fuels of just 0.4%. So we think of this as really common sense investing, backing excellent groups, investing in well-managed companies, thinking about long-term risks and opportunities in terms of sustainability. But I would caveat that we have roughly 25 people working on our team, and we are able to access some of the best groups globally, and that's not a luxury available to all investors. So I think more widely, there is a prevalence of passive investing, buying into markets and backing companies regardless of their quality. Although I think some of the large passive managers are now making meaningful progress in their approach to climate change. But I'm going to now move on from how we invest to aspects that make us relatively unusual for an investor, but very similar to those here today. And that is that we have a highly intelligent, informed and passionate group of beneficiaries, the academic body of the University of Oxford. So since 2014, we have seen two student and academic-led divestment campaigns at Oxford. So those leading these campaigns have an undeniably more ethical focus than our risk-based approach. However, while we may have different motivations, quite often we are actually seeking to achieve the same goal. Although I would say that there will always be a tension point with respect to the strict governance of managing an endowment. So to run you through these two divestment processes, in 2015, following a substantial review across the university with inputs from over 40 departments, colleges, committees, a formal commitment was made to restrict investments in thermal coal and oil sands, i.e. the most polluting fossil fuels. And these were the student-led demands at the time. But last year in 2020, there was a further campaign. And this time we made much more of a front foot on engaging directly with the key student liaison who facilitated collaboration between us, the activists and the climate scientists. And this was aided by better outreach from us over the past 5 years. So we already knew the climate scientists and we were familiar with their work. The outcome of this was 3 resolutions, and I will spare you the technical governance around these, but they are focused on, firstly, divestment from fossil fuel extractors, formal divestment, formalised engagement on net zero planning across the portfolio, and a new member of the Oxford University Investment Committee with specific sustainability experience. Hugh Van Steenis was appointed last November. So much of this formalised process is already in place, but with good collaboration and communication, we were able to find solutions that satisfied the students and academics, whilst also maintaining the ability of the endowment to retain its focus on its core purpose of funding education and research. So I'm just going to conclude with what have we learned? Well, we are more aligned in tackling the problem of climate change than we are not. And really, therefore, communication is everything. We recognise it's not just enough to have a website. I now present to students annually, I meet with students, and I sit on the university's wider environmental sustainability committee. And in terms of our next steps, continued engagement on this very important issue with our investment groups, and also more publicly available reporting. So that brings me to the end of my prepared comments. Thank you very much for listening. I will now hand back to Barbara, and I'm very much looking forward to listening to the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Jonathan Macy's is Sam Harris, Professor of Corporate Law, Corporate Finance and Securities Law at Yale University, and Professor in the Yale School of Management. He has taught at major universities throughout the world, including Bocconi University in Milan, the University of Tokyo, the University of Toronto, the University of Turin, the University of Amsterdam, Department of Finance, and the Stockholm School of Economics, Department of Law. He has also been professor of law at the University of Chicago and visiting professor of law at Harvard Law School. Thank you. We look forward to your presentation. Clearly, lots of experience around the world. You're on, Professor Jonathan Macy.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm extremely pleased to appear on this panel. Thank you at the University of Cape Town for organizing this. I want to say a few words about how we organize the ethical investing issues at Yale University. So Yale University is governed by a governing body, a board of trustees, which is called the Yale Corporation. And this governing body has adopted a set of ethical investing principles that are reflected in a book called The Ethical Investor, written by one of my Yale Law School colleagues, John Simon, and some of his graduate students. And essentially, the investment policy attempts to navigate the fact that the university depends on the endowment critically to fund the budget. The endowment is about $31.2 billion. It's the largest source of funds for the Yale budget. It actually contributes 34% of the operating budget, and the rest of the operating budget is from funds from clinical practice at the medical school, government and foundation grants, donations to operating expenses, and finally tuition. So there's a tremendous amount of responsibility placed on the endowment to generate resources, and there is also a strongly held view that a challenge with ethical investing is that limiting the scope of options of fund managers who invest the university's endowments necessarily reduces returns. So there's a constant balancing between the need to maximize the returns on the endowment on the one hand and the need to generate sufficient funding to maintain the corpus of the endowment, but also to use the earnings or some of the earnings generated by the endowment to fund research and teaching. So our basic organizing principle is that we will first engage with bad corporate actors, what we call bad capitalists, if you will. And but if that is not possible and grave social injury continues to occur, then we will divest. And some examples of some divestment choices that we've made are very recently, within the last 2 weeks, divesting from certain fossil fuel companies that are particularly contributing to global warming and climate change. We divest from entities that corporations that are contributing to the ongoing human rights and genocide in Sudan. We have a particularly American problem. We divest from retail sellers of assault weapons so large retail outlets and sporting goods stores that sell assault weapons. And then we have an activist policy for issues like tobacco and private prisons, where we vote the proxies in tobacco companies and private prison companies in a socially conscious way to ban, vote against targeting children or private prisons that don't hold themselves up to reasonable standards of human rights and rehabilitation in their prison operations. We have a significant amount of student interest. Let me see if I can find the slide. I don't know if people can see the slide. Can someone tell me if they can?
Oh, we can see it, Jonathan.
Oh, great. So this is colleges in the U.S., as you may be aware, have sports is a very important part of college life. This picture is from the halftime. That is the interval in the middle of the game in the annual Harvard-Yale football game, which is the most important sporting events at both schools. You can see the stadium's fairly full, and the students in favor of divesting from fossil fuels from both Harvard and Yale during the game coordinated their actions. And this says President Bacow, who's the president of Harvard, and President Salovey, who's the president of Yale, should take immediate action on climate change. And this actually produced a significant, response from the university, not really at Harvard, but at Yale. The game happened to be a home game from Yale, incidentally, for what that's worth. That was in New Haven, Connecticut, where Yale is located. In any event, so we're very responsive, or we try to be, to student concerns, but I would think it's safe to say, I may be mistaken in my understanding of how things are at Oxford, and maybe Antonia could comment on this, but I don't think we're quite as activist. We're more on the negative side of ethical investing, in the sense that we engage in divestment practices, but there's to the extent that companies are eligible for investing, those remaining companies, the investments are made by the endowment on a kind of returns maximizing basis. So that's a general introduction to the Yale endowment, and the major committee that advises the endowment is something called the ACIR, the Advisory Committee on Investor Responsibility, which I chair, and we're responsible for voting proxies and making recommendations to the endowment. So I want to leave a lot of time for Q&A. That's my basic introduction, and I look forward to the interactive portion of this program. Thank you.
Okay. I have a few questions perhaps that I'd like to put in. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for their input. And I can say that in particular, I think that what is very clear here is that we have Yale and Oxford, which are relatively wealthy universities as compared to our situation in Africa. And I think that Xolisa made a very good point in saying that there is more of a tendency here in Africa and in developing countries to look at the social, the relevance of the social and environmental factors, which affect us more directly because there's more poverty here. First, I'd like to go to Xolisa, and I'd like to ask Xolisa if he could elaborate on the idea of a just energy transition in the context of development priorities in the global south. Is that an unfair question, Xolisa?
Wow, I feel like you just went for the jugular. But yeah, no, I tend to give my thoughts about it because it is quite a contentious issue, especially because you know, developing countries are heavily reliant on the value of the value chain that produces our fossil fuels, specifically coal mining. And it's a huge employer, and you know, and some of these fossil fuel emitters are also big revenue generators in terms of tax for our country. So when you now have, if ideally in a very ideal world, it would be great to just switch from, you know, high carbon to low carbon within the economy, but there are, you know, intended consequences, the positive of, you know, cutting down on the pollution, but the unintended consequence is that it will then, it means that jobs in the coal value chain are affected. And it then feeds, again, basically back into what I was saying, that it makes the issues of poverty and inequality even worse in a country like ours. And I think when you look at developing countries, it's not just an easy decision of saying divest, but how do you then make sure that you can move the country and the economies to a greener economy with urgency, but make sure that, you know, the people, that the move and the transition is just, there's justice to it, and that's why it's called the just transition. So I think it gives us, or puts us in a very difficult position in developing economies to simply be, or to be simplistic about divesting. Then to say, then how do we then make better use of engagement? And I think, Jonathan, you were saying, you know, the more activist perspective, but for us, I think then it becomes another option to consider. Divesting, yes, that would be a deal, but there are other options that we need to consider, especially as developing countries, because, you know, engagement and changing behavior across the economy is almost the next best thing to divestment.
Yeah, thank you, Clarissa. I think that one would also want to say that it's very interesting that Yale University and other American universities and British universities actually were in the forefront of the disinvestment campaign, the anti-apartheid disinvestment campaigns. And now it looks, according to Professor Macy, as though there is less of an interest. The shift has been more towards climate than I would say the human rights element, you know, that was there before.
Well, I think that in terms of a recent actions over the last few years in Sudan shows we're also extremely interested in human rights. Apartheid in South Africa was a particularly salient and important issue, but the Sudanese problems, you know, are occupying a great deal of our time, and that's a straightforward human rights source of human rights concern that we've taken decisive steps for divesting from companies that are contributing to the human rights problems there.
Would any of the panelists like to say something to that?
Yeah, sorry, Tom here. There's been some interesting questions posed in the chat from two people, and I'd like to take a chance to respond in part to those, because I think it also will open up the scope for further debate and discussion amongst the panelists. The first is a detailed question from David LePage, who is the coordinator of the fossil-free UCT campaign. And he's posted a detailed question in the chat, which I'm not going to read out in entirety. I will say, and I will apologize up front for not naming the entities that led the campaign to get UPRI formed. They were the Fossil-Free UCT and the Green Campus Initiative. But I did mention that the establishment of UPRI was driven by those advocacies. The points that David makes about the South African investment environment are incredibly well made, and I think one should be careful not to trivialize them at all. To say that UPRI has a very long, hard road ahead of itself, I think is if anything an understatement. One of the great barriers, which I think we are, as UPRI, are going to face, is that is actually lies in the nature of the work of the foundation and its trustees. Antonio mentioned, I think it was, that they had 25 staff members working at Oxford Endowment Management. The UCT Foundation has precisely 0 full-time employees. The trustees are members drawn from the South African investment community who devote their time and by goodwill to the activities of the foundation. And likewise, UPRI does not have any of its own staffing. And so one of the questions which this raises is that when one talks about, for example, the UN principles of responsible investment, and they lay out a suite of possible options, one of which is a process of stakeholder engagement and proxy voting and responsible ownership of those shares. This, the nature of the foundation as trustees and how they donate their time to UCT raises obstacles in terms of direct engagement. One of the things which we are currently discussing with the Joint Investment Committee and the trustees is the possibility of employing a third-party proxy voting service to actually engage on UCT's behalf as a third-party proxy. Lisa spoke to the question of the just energy transition, and that is certainly a matter of grave concern, against which, of course, is the fact that the fossil fuel industry in South Africa is very extreme in terms of its relative pollution globally, both relative to our economy as well as to our position in world rankings. And I think that here, where UPRI's work is going to be developing, I think this is where the engagements of the next while we engage with the campus community is going to go, is to start thinking possibly about a bifurcated approach to our investment. We have assets which are invested offshore, and we have assets invested domestically. Assets invested offshore might well lend themselves to a far more rapid approach towards the fossil fuel issue. There's a much wider range of investment vehicles to engage in, many of which are explicitly not invested in fossil fuels, whereas in the South African market things might be more complicated. So I think that's part of that nuanced and subtle approach which we are going to be taking to this issue, is to kind of separate out the different classes of our investments. There's also part of David's question. There was he mentions and quotes the Climate Emergency Investment Plan for UCT that was endorsed by the University Convocation in December. He lays out what those, investment plans should look like. As is the case with the Yale entity, is that the UPRI's role is largely advisory. We will certainly pursue, after due process and due consultation, a process of trying to get implementation of our recommendations. But ultimately, our recommendations are advisory, and that is an ongoing battle. And I'm sure that Professor Macy would want to talk about that as well. That same problem of how does an advisory body actually kind of get teeth. One of the ways I think we're going to do this is to ensure that our recommendations are made public once they've been finalized within UPRI, so that the university community can see what UPRI's done, what its recommendations are, and then hold the university and the foundation and the trustees to say, well, this is the recommendation from UPRI, what are you doing about it? That is not a hugely powerful approach, but I think it is one way of actually showing what we are trying to do. Professor Winkler asks similar questions. He asks about what is the university planning to do to take action on setting a goal for transition to net zero, supporting student-led projects, decarbonizing the portfolio of investments. And certainly many of those things are exactly what the university panel is going to be engaging with in the next while, and we would welcome all and any submissions on these things to help us bolster the case when we finally get to making those recommendations. Professor Winkler also asked whether we are able to support student-led projects addressing climate change and development. insofar as that is possible with a zero budget and donated time, those things are worthwhile. And I think those are our conversations, which I think we would dearly like to continue to have. If the panel is not responsive to its university community, ultimately it's going to wither and be deemed to be irrelevant. And we need to make sure that by engaging with this community, that we do seek to our continued relevance. I do see that there's a question in the chat to Antonia and Jonathan about what does your university's public disclosure on investments look like, and what can be shared with those. And so maybe if Antonia and Jonathan want to weigh in on some of the issues I've raised, as well as that specific question.
And Jonathan, would you like me to go first, or?
Please, thank you so much, Antonia.
Okay, well, we've worked on our public disclosure an enormous amount over the past 7 years. We have a website, www.oum.co.uk. I'd recommend everyone visit it. And we are also a global investor, and we are competing, as I mentioned, to get in some of the best investment groups globally, and they have significant confidentiality clauses. So whilst we can't give full disclosure on the names of investments, what we can do is talk about our processes, our exposures, how much we're investing in certain sectors. We really tried to give a very good overview of our approach to ESG, to sustainability, and where we can, good public disclosure. And we're increasing that all the time.
So we have two issues of transparency in our investment. One is we are firmly of the view that not only should the contents, the actual assets in the endowment, remain confidential, but also the choice of fund managers that we have. Our endowment is actively invested with hedge funds and venture capital firms, and their identities are, the university insists that those identities be kept confidential because there's a significant problem of free riding. But also, in terms of transparency, there's another important issue which we've just resolved at Yale really within the last 2 weeks, and that is from the first time when particular companies come to be no longer eligible for investment. So we're divesting from, say, PetroChina that does business in South Sudan and Sudan, or a fossil fuel company that's engaged in thermal coal production, or something like that. We will publicize the names of those companies. So we think that's a very important strategy for kind of creating a list and bringing attention to companies that we feel are not acting in a socially responsible way. And we feel that's far more effective, frankly, than a kind of a blanket divestment policy, which essentially blames no one and holds sort of the best corporate actors in natural gas equally responsible from the most egregious, thermal coal producer of something of that nature.
I have a question for Antonio, which is, do you think that there is a need for a gender-based analysis in responsible investment?
So it's a very interesting question, thank you. And I know that Jonathan also has some comments on this, but I will kick off. Really, in this instance, what we really believe in leading by example. And within our endowment office, my CIO and my COO are both female. They have been for over a decade. We have a roughly 50% gender split. And across the portfolio, we're really looking for the best performance. And we found the outcome of that is that our portfolio is highly diversified in terms of background, gender perhaps less so, but we're really looking for diversity of thought. And in order to get that, you have to have diversity and inclusion. What I would say is particularly is that the investment industry certainly has a bit of an image problem in the UK, because we find that when we're hiring, at the analyst and intern level, I always get very, very depressed at how few women actually apply at these very junior positions. And I think we need to move away from the perception that this is all Wall Street and actually really begin to talk about what an interesting analytical and creative role it can be and how you can have a real and lasting impact on society through investments.
So the initiatives for diversity are something that the investments office at Yale, which manages the endowment, takes very seriously. And we're in the middle. We would have a significant, probably 50% gender diversity in the endowments office, and gender and ethnic diversity as a primary goal has been communicated to all of Yale's fund managers and fund managers who are not sufficiently diversified will not be eligible to invest money on behalf of Yale.
Okay. I have a question here also for both Antonio and Jonathan, which is, what does your university public disclosure on investments look like, and what can be shared with attendees? What does your university's public disclosure on investments look like, and what can be shared with attendees?
Well, we publicize the returns on our endowment, and we publicize the names of companies that we're divesting from, or as we call it, not eligible for investing. But we don't publish the assets, the particular financial assets that populate the endowment portfolio.
And very much in line with Yale, we don't give, because of, we're competing against other global investors in order to make an investment return for the university. And there are substantial confidentiality agreements. We don't publish the specific names within the portfolio, but we do a lot of disclosure around how we choose investments, our investment process, and in environment, how we think about environmental and sustainability issues on our website.
Okay.
There's also
I think I'd like Tom to say something to that. Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, thank you. No, I was going to pick up on a question which is in the chat, which asks about the approaches to impact investment. There's a question which is directed to both Oxford and Yale. But just to mention that in the South African context, this is something which is starting to take root as well, this idea of impact investing, which would have long-term social and societal benefits, which might involve investment in alternative energy. It might involve investment in other things which might capacitate development. These things, I think, are certainly they're taking root. I think it's something which is taking root in the investment space generally. The question of how one evaluates those impacts and what I think for us, in the things that have come before us so far, are quite complex to evaluate as to whether this is a vehicle to kind of basically greenwash investments, or whether it is really meant to capacitate real change. And I would certainly be interested in Antonio and Jonathan's comments about impact investing and what issues you've come across, and whether this can't, whether there is a risk of this being used as a vehicle for greenwashing.
Again, Jonathan, do you mind if I jump in? Oh, I'm going to. So what we would say is that really the impact of our fund is education and research for the university, and everything that goes into that fund has to make an investment return to add to that purpose. Now, if it articulates a further purpose, all the better for it, and we are thrilled with that. And they obviously, but unfortunately, quite often the investment return for our purpose must come first. But we're very lucky with these thousands of ideas annually, and therefore we can be very selective on making sure that we make that investment return. And the other thing I would say is that we do have some groups who have articulated a particular social mission, but one of the things that is more powerful is getting, dare I say it, more traditionally minded groups to think about environmental and social impacts of their portfolio on companies which might not be considered in the impact space, because these companies have a huge impact on society. So actually what we would prefer to see is a portfolio which is fully analysed for environmental and social risks, rather than a sort of specific section for an impact.
Given that wind and solar photovoltaics are now cheaper in financial terms than coal for electricity generation, why do you still hesitate to invest in the economy of the future?
I feel like I'm getting the tough questions this evening.
I think that's a great question. I would be very curious if Antonio would explain why Oxford hasn't divested from metallurgical coal. It sounded like you're only divesting from thermal coal.
Well, it's not a fossil fuel.
I'll have to answer. Okay, I do sit on the UCT Retirement Fund, so I'm not sure if the question is meant from the UCT Retirement Fund perspective. I certainly am not with the UPRI. I'm just an invited guest, so I can't speak for UPRI. But part of the challenge in the market is not necessarily only limited to, clean energy projects. When retirement funds, for example, they invest in instruments. So these investments in clean energy, in clean tech, still need to go and undergo a process of being packaged to make it easier for a pension fund with liabilities that are quite different to your endowment to be able to invest and disinvest when it's needed. And part of the difficulty of not having these completely packaged as listable instruments, for instance, it really impacts on the liquidity risk that pension funds are really struggling with. When you have large disinvestment events, I mean, COVID has meant that we lost members. And when then assets need to be disinvested, it becomes difficult to go and disinvest from a product that is not suitable or not suitably packaged to enable that exit. So I think more than anything else, we want to throw it out into the market and we keep engaging. I know from a personal perspective, every moment I get to fund managers to say, please bring us investable in instruments and not projects, because pension funds and their DCOAs are not able to it's not easy for us to invest in projects. Instruments is what we need. So yeah, that is my response in terms of that. But I also wanted to ask quickly in terms of the impact, based on the question around impact and impact investment, what kind of impact investment measurement tools are you using? Because it would be interesting to hear what is applicable. There's so many that are now popping up out there in the market, and what is your experience in terms of using them and measuring your impact?
Since we don't do impact investing, we don't measure it.
Fair enough.
Kalisa, in the same respect, we have if a group has designated itself as a specific social purpose, they are in charge of the metrics on that. But you raise a very good point that metrics are both improving hugely of those that are available, but there are many out there, and it's difficult to refine it. One of the things that we have done is that one of the groups that we have invested in is creating a metrics based on the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're hoping to work with that group to understand this area better ourselves.
Thank you. Professor Macy, did you have something more to say?
Oh, I see that Mr. von Blotnitz has a question about how we engage with major fossil fuel manufacturers. We have a strong policy of engaging before divesting. except we have an exception for fossil fuel manufacturers. We think the climate change science is well enough established, so we don't engage. We, to the extent that they're violating our norms, we put them on the ineligible for investment list.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think, unfortunately, it seems as though we have much more to say, but very little time. I'd like to thank everybody for their input, and I'd like to stress again that today is actually the launch of UPRI at UCT. And as Professor Tom Moultrie hopes, and all of us do, we hope that this goes beyond the university community to the greater South African community. And I'd now like to call upon our Vice Chancellor at the University of Cape Town, Professor Creti, to say a few words for Creti Pakeng. It's because I know her other name, so I was lost there for a minute.
Thank you, Ma'am Barbara, and thank you to everyone who attended. Let me start by indicating that taking responsibility for how our financial investments affect the environment and our society is not an individual effort, it's an institutional effort. It is not even something that can just be done by the management or just the council alone. We have to go together as a community. The University Panel for Responsible Investment, ably chaired by Professor Tom Moultrie, recognized the importance of engaging with the UCT community on issues such as how we can effect a just transition to a world that is free of fossil fuels. And I fully support this engagement. And I encourage all members of UCT to read the Responsible and Sustainable Investment Policy and to voice your opinion on it. Try to do that by the 14th of May. And you can send your opinions on it or your views on it to the UPRI or UPRI email address. And the email address is upri-group@uct.ac.za. We all have a duty to ourselves and a duty to future generations to be aware of the kinds of decisions that have to be considered in sustainable investments. I'm very proud that UCT, as far as we know, appears to be the first academic institution in the Global South to walk this journey. And I hope that others will join us. Meanwhile, today we can celebrate the formal start of our journey. On behalf of UCT, I want to thank Barbara Masekela for moderating this important discussion. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be with us tonight. Thank you to our guest speakers, Ms. Antonia Coed and Mr. Jonathan Macy, for sharing the experiences of sustainable investment in Oxford and Yale, respectively. And Mr. Xolisa Dlamini from our own Graduate School of Business for providing a local context on responsible investment. I thank Professor Tom Moultrie and the members of the UPRI for their leadership and for providing such a well-informed policy document to engage with. I thank UCT's Joint Investment Committee and Council for their support of the policy. I thank our colleagues in the Communications and Marketing Department and ICTS for organizing and managing this event. And most importantly, thank you, colleagues, to all of you who attended. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for engaging with us on this important topic at this very launch of UPRI. And thank you very much. Have a good evening and have a good day to those of you who are elsewhere in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you very much.